Welcome to On the Ballot, Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for being with us. I'm joined now by Ryan Byrne of our Ballot Measure team. I'm excited to talk to him about one of my favorite reports that we produce every year. It's called the Ballot Measure Readability Study. Essentially what that means is, how easy is it to decipher ballot measures? And we've been publishing this for a few years now, and it's a really fun one. So Ryan, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So let's talk a little bit about this report. So put it, and if you can just quickly summarize for our listeners, how is it that we assess objectively how easy it is to read a ballot measure?
Right, that's a good question because you emphasized the word objectively. You know, ballot measures address all sorts of different topics, and it's really hard to evaluate kind of the complexity of that topic. So what these scores are doing is they actually look at the objective structure of language. So the number of syllables, the number of words, the number of sentences, things of that sort. So it's important to note, they're not necessarily getting into the complexity of ideas, and ballot measures can address a lot of ideas. What they are addressing is syllables, words, that type of stuff.
Let's talk about this year's report. Did the objective report we did, does it seem like ballot measures are getting a little easier or a little harder to read on the whole?
So it's interesting because they decreased on average. So again, on a whole, there's 159 ballot measures though, from what is equivalent to the 19th grade in 2022 to the 16th grade. What is even 19? It's like something in postgraduate. 16 is equivalent to, right? 12 plus 4, so finishing a bachelor's degree.
Right.
So it went down a little bit. Is that significant? Is it not? I think maybe when you're thinking of numbers that high, it doesn't seem like it. But you could think about like the difference between 11th grade and 8th grade, right? So there is a difference with 3 years.
So we saw a drop, meaning things are getting a little easier to read. So let's just use like an example just to try to understand it. What was the most complicated ballot measure, the hardest ballot measure, the one with the highest score from, say, this year's group that we studied?
Yeah, so it's actually a bond measure out in Maine question 3, which scored at a grade level of 42, which granted doesn't actually translate into anything, right? No formal education anyway. What that basically just indicates when it's 42 is that it's really difficult to understand grammatically. It's a bond measure, $25 million for the Maine Technology Institute. And I think if you look at it, the issue with some of those finance measures, bonds and things like that is, it might not necessarily be the hardest thing in the world to understand as an idea, but they're really long, complex words. And that's what's kind of driving it to such a high number.
Yeah, we always kind of talk about this internally because, one of the reasons why we exist at Ballotpedia and one of the reasons why we publish our articles is to make it easier for voters to understand what's going to be in front of them on the ballot. So we actually kind of internally use these grade evaluations because the more complicated a ballot measure is, the harder our job is to go understand the ballot measure and try to put it in lay terms for our readers. Do you find that's the case, when you and your team are working on these measures? Does this sort of anecdotally translate where you're like, yeah, the ones that score a little higher, take us a little longer to parse out and understand and process?
That depends. The ballot question itself doesn't always correlate with the ballot measure text because people don't typically see the whole text on their ballot. It gets processed by an official or someone else who, shortens multiple pages of legal language, which granted is pretty complicated itself, into something that's much more condensed.
That's a whole nother election show topic for us about who is in charge of the actual wording that appears in the ballot that voters will see.
Yeah. So I would say, it can be, I think the difficult part is less our teams understanding it and more how our teams can write about it, because sometimes a lot of those complex terms like general obligation bond, right? It has a lot of syllables, and explaining to people what that means. To a finance person, they know what that means, but to a more typical audience, you might not.
Okay, so you said this year the readability score lowered. How does that compare overall to say what we've seen over the last, few years? What's the trend looking like?
Right. So, the trend, it's marginal, but it's actually marginally downwards. The first year we did this was in 2017, and it scored at 20, and it kind of stayed around there. Then went a little bit down, 18, 19, and this year it's down to 16. So we're actually kind of seeing a decline. And to what degree that reflects any substantive changes, I'm not sure yet. That's perhaps a mystery for us to further explore as to what has changed. I think if it goes down a few more years, then I would really think something changed. But right now, it's a little hard to tell whether that's just some kind of variation or if there's actually something going on there in terms of how the texts are being written.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let's look at a couple of states then for some examples. So tell us a little bit about, say, New Hampshire and Alabama and how their ballot measures scored this year in the evaluation and what that tells us about how these measures are constructed.
There's a constitutional amendment in New Hampshire that would increase the mandatory judicial retirement age. That's a whole topic. We could get into that. But it scored the lowest of all of our questions so far this year at grade level 7. Meanwhile, in Alabama, we've had 2 constitutional amendments, one that voters already decided on and one that they will decide on in November, that scored at 28. So you have this really wide variation. And I think that wide variation, we'll probably talk a little bit more about the factors that cause these variations, but just the state that it is seems to be the most significant factor because each state, right, has different roles, has different, even just histories of writing language, even if it's not necessarily a role. And that is what influences this. And, I could go on. Ballot measures, right, they're very much a state-based process. You don't really have a whole lot of federal law defining them. It is primarily a state-based thing, and states decide if they have ballot measures, and states decide the rules for ballot measures. So there's just significant variation.
Yeah, so 26 of them with initiated by referendum. So let's talk about that for a minute. Have we found any correlation or any statistical significance to the readability scores of initiatives, which are put on the ballot by voters, versus legislatively referred measures where the state legislature is putting something before voters? Does it seem like there's any difference there, or is there really kind of no statistical significance whatsoever?
Yeah, there's a small difference. Initiatives pretty much consistently do a little better than referrals, and I think that's primarily because referrals are coming from state legislatures, right? And they're often translating legal language into what is perhaps still legal language. So their questions tend to be a little bit more difficult to understand, and then initiatives are generally being written by certain departments within the executive branch, whether it's the Secretary of State or an Attorney General or a board or commission.
Yeah, so it sounds like certain topic types lend themselves to be sort of more prone to an easier, so to speak, readability score. And some say like bond measures are probably a little more prone to be sort of on the higher side of things because there's a lot more wording needed to describe what the measure is to a voter. So let's talk about Amendment 2 in Florida. This amendment got a -2. What's that all about?
Right. So this was our first ballot measure to actually ever score below 0, which I didn't realize was possible with these formulas.
Just a picture then? What's that mean?
It's just a couple words. So -2, you could think of it as like, so the scores actually are supposed to translate to grade level. So -2 isn't so much like pre-existing human. It's more like 2 years before first grade. So you're thinking something a preschooler could maybe understand, right? So the ballot title is just Right to Hunt and Fish. All 1-syllable words, just 5 of them. Granted, like I said, a complexity of idea. Right, what is a right? That's a bigger question for people. What does it mean for something to be a right? But right to hunt and fish is pretty simplistic grammatically and kind of gets the gist of it across.
Gotcha. Yeah, very interesting. Is there anything specific about, say, some of the more hot button topics of this year, whether it's abortion or, wage-related measures or election administration-related measures? And when looking at that, did we come across anything about the language being more complicated one way or the other?
Yeah, this is actually one area that I was surprised because you think describing the issue of abortion, particularly the types of ballot measures that we're seeing, which are, typically fairly short, related to constitutional rights, things of that. They actually, when we just looked at a range of topics, they were one of the higher scoring ones. And then wages, and you think wages would be pretty complicated, right? You're dealing with some financial stuff, some of the language involving that, and it scored the lowest of these topics. And somehow ranked choice voting was in the middle. It was just somewhat unexpected, which perhaps gets to, and again, this is something that people could look further into in terms of who's writing these. Is there debate over how things are written? Ballot language is something that supporters and opponents often disagree on. So at least based on our topics chain, it's almost like these more competitive topics are scoring a little worse than other ones.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, states are paying attention to this. There's been some legislation in the states that has been passed in recent years, specifically tying the rules and requirements around how questions are worded to these scoring systems. What are some of the states that have been active, and what is that looking like?
Yeah, so there's been a few states in recent years that have passed laws related to readability. A couple years ago, 2019, we saw one in Maine. Now, these don't always require a specific grade level, and when they do, they aren't necessarily requiring a specific formula, and these aren't necessarily absolute demands. You see, I'm including a bunch of like if statements here. So so to what degree, they're actually fully implemented relative to other things, right? Because the Secretary of State's, all these offices, they're also kind of addressing, the complexity of the idea and things of that sort. So we saw one in Maine that said that questions had to be, in quotes, written as simply as possible. One in North Dakota in 2023 saying plain, clear, understandable language using words with common everyday meaning. New York also in 2023, no higher than an 8th grade reading level. And that actually came up this year because they have one constitutional amendment on the ballot. There were a number of debates around the language, but one of the debates was some people did not sense that it was actually at an 8th grade reading level. And there are different formulas, but according to our formula, that was indeed the case. Our formula ranked it at grade 13. And again, there's different formulas. I don't know what they're using. The one we use because it's what the U.S. Department of Defense and U.S. Navy use, and there's been a number of academic studies that have used it, but there are other ones. And then the most recent bill was in Rhode Island, where they also passed one that said that ballot language had to be understood by a person with an 8th grade reading level. I think Rhode Island's average was 14, so not 8, and they ranged from, one at grade 8, which they actually didn't pick the language for, but that's a different story. It's a constitutional convention question, came from the Constitution itself. And then 4 bond measures, and those bond measures ranged from 13 to 19. And again, we've talked about bonds a bit. They can be quite complicated.
What has been the median in recent years? Like, is it the case that 8th grade is usually like kind of really rare, or is that kind of the median that we find? I mean, how common is that?
Yeah, so 8th grade, we see 8th grade come up a lot, and I think that's because I haven't necessarily done the research on this myself, but you often see in publications. Then 8th grade reading level, if you can get something down to that, you've now included the vast majority of people of voting age adults. So not many actually score that low. I think just looking at this year, we had 3 states, New Hampshire, Utah, and Alaska. Alaska was 9, so New Hampshire and Utah, and everyone else was above.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so not necessarily many, at least using this scoring system, have scored near 8th grade.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting, Ryan. It'll be very fascinating to see if other states take on legislation like this in years ahead. It certainly doesn't sound like, from the states that have passed legislation so far, that's a necessarily partisan issue one way or the other. So what else, what did we miss, Ryan? What are some last little tidbits that you want to share with our listeners about a readability index?
Right. I think there's a few things that I could touch on. I do just want to reiterate the partisanship, and that you hear so much about partisanship with ballot measures and ballot measure legislation and the rules governing ballot measures. But the states that have passed these, they have been nearly unanimous in every case by both sides of the aisle. So it is very much something that if it's on legislators' radar, they may indeed seek to address it. Some other things, one of the fun things that we look at too with our readability scores, because this affects readability, is length. And ballot measures, we talk about, based on some of the academic research that we've looked into, the more complicated language is, the more likely people are to actually skip it. So maybe that's one effect of seeing a small decline is maybe there's less people skipping them. I think, and this is me just kind of speculating a little bit more, but it probably also correlates with length. We have some long ballot measures out there. And that's always a struggle too for election officials, if you think about it, because if you right to hunt and fish might be good enough because it's a constitutional amendment and it describes it, but there may be a point in which something is too short to understand it. There may also be a point in which it's so long, right, that it becomes difficult to understand. So the words vary a lot, and I'm sure that affects readability as well.
Well, Rad, very interesting. Always love having you on the show, and always love getting this report in my inbox. And I hope all your listeners enjoyed talking about readability, and check out the full report on ballotpedia.org. Ryan, great to have you. See you soon.
As always, thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our ballot measure coverage at the link in our show notes. Election season is here, and you can count on us being in your feed a little more often. So make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pallet, and thanks for listening.